The day I found the letters in my grandfather's attic, I learned that the family story I had been raised around was not just wrong. My name is Clara Fenwick. It had been engineered. For my entire life, my mother had carried the shame of something she had never done, and the woman who had put that shame on her was her own sister. My Aunt Persimmon had convinced my grandfather to disown my mother over a lie she made up more than 30 years earlier, and she had done it so cleanly, so confidently, that almost everyone in the family simply accepted it as history. By the time I was old enough to ask questions, the answers had hardened into little phrases people used to avoid telling the whole story. They said my mother had broken her parents' hearts. They said she had betrayed the family. They said grandfather Emerick had been strict, but not unfair. And whenever I asked my mother what had really happened, she would look away and say, "Some stories become impossible to correct once people decide they need them to be true." I thought she meant she had done something she regretted. I did not understand that she meant nobody had ever let her defend herself. My mother, Liora Fenwick, was the gentlest person I knew, but there was always one sealed room inside her life. She had been cut off by her father before I was born. She was not invited to family holidays at his house. She did not receive birthday calls from him. She never brought us to his orchard property in Vermont, even though my cousins grew up running through those fields every summer. My Aunt Persimmon did. Persimmon was the daughter who stayed. Persimmon was the daughter in the photographs beside grandfather Emerick at charity dinners, courthouse steps, church anniversaries, and family reunions. Persimmon was the one who spoke for him when he got older, who organized his medications, who held the keys to the house, who knew which lawyer had drafted which version of the will. My mother was a ghost in her own family, and the cruelest part was that nobody seemed to find that strange. They treated her absence like a sad consequence of her own choices. Even as a girl, I knew something did not fit. My mother never sounded guilty when the subject came up. She sounded exhausted. There is a difference. Guilt bends a person inward. Exhaustion makes them stop reaching for a door that has already been locked too many times. When I was 13, I once asked her directly, "Did you really have an affair with somebody's husband?" She had been washing a saucepan in the sink, and her hands went still under the water. She turned the faucet off, dried her fingers slowly, and said, "No, Clara, I did not." That was the first and only plain denial she gave me until everything came out. I remember feeling a strange relief, followed immediately by anger. "Then why does everyone say you did?" She gave me a sad little smile and said, "Because your grandfather believed the person who accused me before he ever believed me." I asked who accused her, and she said, "It does not matter anymore." But it did matter. It mattered so much that it had shaped every branch of our family tree. The story, as it was always told in fragments, was this. When my mother was in her mid-20s, she was accused of having an affair with a married family friend, a man who had been close to my grandparents for years. His name was Roland Vale. He and his wife had attended church with my grandparents, contributed to the same local museum fund, and spent summers at the same lakeside community. The affair supposedly devastated my grandmother, Maeve, who had already been ill. Grandfather Emerick, proud and rigid and obsessed with moral reputation, disowned my mother soon afterward. He removed her from family accounts, stopped speaking to her, and eventually revised his will so that Persimmon would receive almost everything. The official family explanation was that my mother had never fully admitted what she had done, which somehow made it worse in grandfather's eyes. I only ever heard it from other people. My mother did not tell it that way. She did not tell it at all. Grandfather Emerick died in late November, on a wet, gray morning after 2 weeks in hospice. He was 89. I had met him only a handful of times in my life, and always in stiff, accidental ways. Once at a funeral, once at a hospital, once at a grocery store when I was 7, and he pretended not to know who I was until Persimmon whispered something in his ear. My mother did not go to the hospital during his final days. She said there was no invitation, and she would not force herself into a room where she had been unwanted for 30 years. But after he died, Persimmon called her. I was in my mother's kitchen when it happened. My mother put the phone on speaker because her hands were shaking too badly to hold it. Persimmon's voice came through soft and formal. "Liora, I think you should come to the house next week. There are personal things to sort through. Dad left instructions for some household items, but there are boxes that belong to Mother too. It seems right that you have a chance to look." My mother closed her eyes. After all this time, Persimmon sighed, as if she were the one being asked to carry something heavy. "He is gone now. We should try to be decent." I almost laughed out loud at that. decent. That word, coming from her, would take on a bitter shine later. My mother agreed to go, but only if I came with her. She said she did not trust herself to walk through that house alone. The following Saturday, we drove 2 hours north to grandfather's property. I had seen it only from the road as a child, a white farmhouse with black shutters, a stone wall, and apple trees stretching behind it in long disciplined rows. Persimmon's car was already parked out front when we arrived. She came onto the porch wearing a long navy coat and pearl earrings, her silver blonde hair pinned into the same neat twist she had worn for as long as I could remember. She kissed the air beside my mother's cheek and said, "Liora, Clara, thank you for coming." My mother looked smaller standing there. She was 62, with soft brown hair going gray at the temples, but in that doorway she looked like a young woman being brought back to the place where she had been sentenced. Inside, the house smelled like dust, cedar, and old heating oil. Persimmon had labeled rooms with sticky notes: dining room silver, library books, Mother Maeve's linens, attic storage. She explained everything in a brisk voice, as if we were volunteers at an estate sale. My mother barely spoke. She touched the banister once and withdrew her hand as if it had burned her. For the first hour, we sorted through boxes in the front parlor. Most of them held old Christmas ornaments, framed photographs, and folded tablecloths. Persimmon kept finding reasons to narrate. Daddy loved this photo. Daddy always wanted the china kept together. Daddy said the orchard tools should go to the Historical Society. She said Daddy so many times that I wanted to ask if she knew my mother had had a father too. Around midday, Persimmon told me there were more boxes in the attic and asked if I would bring them down. My mother was sitting at the dining table with a stack of my grandmother's recipe cards in front of her, her face pale and unreadable. I said yes because I needed air. The attic stairs were narrow and steep, tucked behind a door at the end of the upstairs hall. I climbed with my phone flashlight on, ducking under the low beams. The attic was colder than the rest of the house. Dust floated in the light. There were trunks, hat boxes, cracked lampshades, rolled rugs, and plastic bins with Persimmon's handwriting on the labels. Near the far wall, half hidden behind a cedar chest, I saw an old cardboard stationery box tied with faded green ribbon. It did not have a label. The lid was soft at the corners, and when I pulled it toward me, dust smeared across my palms. I opened it expecting photographs or greeting cards. Instead, I found letters. Dozens of them, bundled in groups with string. The envelopes were yellowed and stamped, many still bearing postmarks. The handwriting on the front was slanted and elegant. Miss Persimmon Fenwick, my darling Percy. Percy, my heart. I knew that nickname. Persimmon hated her full name as a child, according to family stories, and everyone had called her Percy until she decided it sounded childish. I sat back on my heels and opened the top letter. I was not trying to invade anyone's privacy. That is what I told myself at first. I was sorting an estate. But after the first few lines, my skin went cold. The letter was from Roland Vale. He wrote to Persimmon like a lover, not a family friend. He referred to a night at the lake house, to her green dress, to the danger of Maeve noticing how they looked at each other across dinner. He wrote, "Your father trusts me completely, which makes me ashamed and grateful in equal measure." He wrote that his wife suspected nothing yet. He wrote that he could not stop thinking about Persimmon's hands. The date at the top was June 12, 1989. That was the year my mother had supposedly destroyed the family by having an affair with Roland Vale. I opened another letter, and another, July 1989. September 1989. January 1990. Each one addressed to Percy. Each one intimate, guilty, unmistakable. There were references to secret meetings, to hiding letters, to Persimmon's fear that her mother was beginning to suspect. One letter mentioned my mother by name, and that was when the attic seemed to tilt around me. Roland had written, "Liora looked so confused last Sunday when your father was sharp with her. I hope you are certain this will pass without harming her. I cannot bear the thought of your family turning on the wrong person, even if silence is the only thing protecting us now." I read that sentence 3 times. My hands were shaking. Below me, somewhere in the house, I heard Persimmon laughing softly at something, the sound drifting up through the floorboards like an insult. I wanted to run downstairs and throw the letters across the dining table. I wanted to demand that she look my mother in the face and explain every year she had stolen. But my mother was in that house, raw with grief and old humiliation, and I had a box of evidence I did not yet fully understand. I forced myself to think. The letters proved Persimmon had been involved with Roland. They strongly suggested my mother had been blamed, but I did not know whether there were more documents, whether Persimmon would claim the letters were fake, whether the estate issue made this legally relevant or only emotionally catastrophic. So I did something that felt both cowardly and necessary. I took the bundle that included the letters from 1989 and 1990, slid it into my tote bag under a folded quilt, and carried 2 unrelated boxes downstairs. Persimmon looked up when I entered. "Find anything useful?" she asked. I looked at her pearl earrings, at her smooth, careful face, and said, "Mostly old linens and lamps." My mother did not notice anything. She was holding one of my grandmother's recipe cards for plum cake, her thumb moving over the handwriting. We left an hour later with a small box of recipes, 2 framed photographs, and the secret that would split the family open. On the drive home, my mother stared out the window. "That house felt exactly the same," she said. "I thought it would feel smaller after all these years." I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my fingers hurt. "Mom," I said, then stopped. She turned toward me. "What is it?" I almost told her. I wanted to. But the image of her reading one letter, then having Persimmon deny everything, rose in my mind. My mother had already spent 30 years being told her truth was not enough. I could not bear to hand her another truth that could be dismissed as uncertain. So I said, "I am just sorry today was hard." She nodded and looked back out at the rain. I hated myself for the silence, but I kept it for 1 week. That week was one of the strangest of my life. I went to work, answered emails, made dinner, and carried the knowledge that my aunt had likely framed my mother for her own affair. Every ordinary thing felt unreal. At night, I spread the letters across my dining table with cotton gloves. I bought from an archival supply store because I was afraid of damaging them. I made a timeline. June 1989, Roland writes to Persimmon about Maeve's suspicions. August 1989, he mentions my grandfather being cold toward Liora. October 1989, he writes, "I know you said letting him believe it was her is the only way, but she looked broken." December 1989, he writes that Persimmon must be careful around the trust documents because your father is already speaking of consequences. That sentence sent me down another path. I called my mother and asked if she still had any letters from that time. I tried to sound casual. She said she had a shoebox in her closet, mostly correspondence from old friends. I went over that evening and told her I was working on a family archive project after seeing the condition of the attic. That part was almost true. She let me look. In her shoebox, I found birthday cards, postcards, and letters from a childhood friend named Maribel. Near the bottom was a draft of a letter my mother had written but never mailed. It was dated November 3, 1989. "Dear Maribel, I do not know what to do. Father has decided something awful about me and will not tell me who put it in his head. He says I know what I have done with Roland Vale, but I have done nothing. I have never been alone with that man for more than 5 minutes. Persimmon is present for every conversation, and she keeps saying that denial will only make Father angrier. Why would she say that if she knows me? Why will no one ask Roland? Why will no one ask me anything, except whether I am ready to confess?" I sat on my mother's bedroom floor with that letter in my lap and had to pretend I was only moved by its sadness, not by the fact that it matched the attic letters exactly. My mother stood in the doorway. "I was so young," she said quietly. I kept thinking if I found the right words, he would hear me. I asked carefully, "Did Aunt Persimmon ever defend you?" My mother gave a humorless little laugh. "No," she cried a lot. "She told Father she was worried about my soul. She told me privately that if I admitted it, maybe he would forgive me. I remember thinking she sounded less like my sister than a witness for the prosecution." That night, after I left her house, I called an estate attorney named Wilhelmina Castellano. A coworker had used her during a complicated probate fight, and I remembered the name because it sounded like someone from a 19th century novel. I expected to leave a message, but her office line forwarded to an answering service, and by the next afternoon she called me back herself. I explained the situation as calmly as I could. I told her my grandfather had recently died. I told her my mother had been disinherited decades ago because of an alleged affair with a married family friend. I told her I had found letters proving that same married man had actually been having an affair with my aunt, the daughter who benefited from my mother's exclusion. I also told her I knew how absurd it sounded to ask whether a 30-year-old family lie could matter in probate court. Wilhelmina listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "It may matter very much depending on the will language, the prior estate documents, and whether the disinheritance can be tied to fraud or misrepresentation. But before anyone confronts your aunt, authenticate the letters." "You think she will deny it?" I asked. Wilhelmina's voice was dry. People deny things while holding the thing they are denying in their hands. Assume denial until evidence makes denial expensive. She referred me to a forensic document examiner named Dr. Helena Moss, who specialized in historical paper, ink, handwriting, and postal verification. I drove the letters to Dr. Moss 2 days later. Her office was in a brick building above a rare book dealer, and she treated the letters with a seriousness that made me feel steadier. She photographed each envelope, examined the paper fibers, noted the stamps and postmarks, and compared Roland's signature to public documents. Wilhelmina's investigator located from old property records and museum board minutes. While that process was underway, I kept gathering context. Wilhelmina obtained copies of my grandfather's estate documents. The oldest version she found, drafted in 1987, divided a family trust equally between Liora and Persimmon, unless one daughter was found by the trustee to have engaged in serious moral misconduct that brought public disgrace upon the family. It was archaic, ugly language, but it was there. My grandfather had inherited money from his own father, and apparently he had built the trust with old-fashioned conditions that reflected his obsession with reputation. In 1991, after the alleged affair, he amended his estate plan. My mother was reduced to a token amount. Persimmon became the primary beneficiary. By the time he died, the final will left Persimmon the house, the orchard land, investment accounts, and most personal property. My mother was mentioned only to say that provision had been made for her during life, which was not true in any meaningful sense. Wilhelmina said, "If your aunt knowingly caused your grandfather to disinherit your mother by assigning her own conduct to your mother, that is not merely family cruelty. That is potentially fraud affecting testamentary intent." Hearing it stated so plainly made my chest tighten. For years, I had thought of inheritance as secondary to the emotional wound. Money could not give my mother back her father, but the estate was not just money. It was the official record of the lie. It was the lie written into property, accounts, furniture, land, and legal language. It was my grandfather's final insult, based on Persimmon's invention. During that week, I saw Persimmon once more before she knew anything. She invited my mother and me to a family lunch at a restaurant near the probate lawyer's office, saying it would be good to discuss household items peacefully. My mother almost declined, but I told her I would go with her. I wanted to watch Persimmon. That sounds cold, but I needed to see whether guilt had any visible shape on her. She arrived early, wearing a cream sweater and a gold watch that had belonged to my grandmother. She kissed my mother's cheek again. She ordered tea. She spoke fondly about Grandfather Emeric's last days, about how peaceful he had been, about how he had asked her to make sure the orchard stayed intact. "He trusted me with the hard things," she said. My mother looked down at her menu. I sat across from Persimmon, knowing that the letters were locked in a fireproof box in my apartment, knowing Dr. Moss was examining the paper, knowing Wilhelmina was reading the trust documents, and Persimmon had no idea the ground under her life had begun to move. She laughed at one point about an old family picnic. "Do you remember Liora when Percy was the only name I would answer to?" she asked. My mother smiled faintly. Yes. I almost stopped breathing. Percy. The name was right there, floating between them. My aunt said it easily, comfortably, as if it did not appear in dozens of letters from the man my mother had been accused of seducing. I studied her face and wondered how many times over 30 years she had heard Roland's name, seen my mother excluded, watched my grandfather's anger harden, and chosen silence. Not one silence. Thousands of silences. A lifetime of them. Dr. Moss called 3 days later. Her conclusion was careful but clear. The letters were genuine period documents. The paper, ink, postal markings, and physical aging were consistent with the dates shown. The handwriting matched known Roland Vale samples. There was no evidence of modern fabrication. She prepared a formal report. Wilhelmina then cross-referenced the dates with family records, travel receipts, and old photographs. Roland Vale had been present at the lake house during several periods mentioned in the letters. Persimmon had been there too. My mother, in at least 2 instances, had not. One photograph from August 1989 showed my mother at a teachers' conference in Burlington on the same weekend. Roland wrote to Persimmon about meeting her near the boathouse. The story my grandfather had believed was not just unsupported, it was physically impossible in places. Once Wilhelmina had the report, she told me it was time to tell my mother. "Do not let your aunt control the first telling," she said. "Your mother deserves to receive the truth from someone who loves her." With the evidence already secured, I drove to my mother's house that evening with copies of the letters in a folder. I had rehearsed what to say, but when she opened the door, all the rehearsed words disappeared. She was wearing gardening gloves and had dirt on one cheek. She smiled and said, "Clara, I was just making soup. Are you all right?" I started crying before I could answer. Her face changed instantly. What happened? We sat at her kitchen table, the same table where I had done homework as a child, where she had paid bills, wrapped gifts, and quietly survived every holiday invitation that never came. I placed the folder between us. "Mom, when we were at grandfather's house, I found letters in the attic. They were written to Aunt Persimmon by Roland Vale." Her body went still. I watched her eyes move from my face to the folder and back again. "Roland," she said, barely above a whisper. "They were love letters," I said. "From 1989 and 1990. They prove he was having an affair with Persimmon, not you." For a moment, she did not move at all. Then she reached for the folder with both hands. I had arranged the copies chronologically, with the most important passages marked lightly. She read the first letter, then the second. Her mouth tightened. By the third, her hands were trembling. When she reached the one where Roland wrote that she had looked broken, she made a sound I will never forget. It was not a sob exactly. It was more like a breath being forced out after 30 years. "She knew," my mother said. "She knew what he was doing to me." I said, "Yes." "She was in the room," my mother whispered. "She stood beside him and cried and told him she was worried about me." She pressed her hand to her chest. I thought she was frightened. I thought she was weak. I did not know she was directing it. I told her about Dr. Moss, about the authentication, about Wilhelmina, about the trust provision. I explained that Persimmon had likely known the estate consequences. My mother listened as if each sentence landed with physical weight. When I finished, she looked toward the dark kitchen window. "Your grandfather died believing I had done this." I had no comforting answer. That was the part no court could repair. He had died inside a lie, and my mother had been locked outside the truth until after he was gone. She stood suddenly and picked up her phone. "I am calling her, Mom. Wilhelmina said we should be careful." "I will be careful," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it had changed. For the first time in my life, I heard steel in it where grief had been. She called Persimmon and put the phone on speaker. Persimmon answered on the fourth ring. "Liora, is everything all right?" My mother looked at me, then down at the letters. "I found out about Roland." Silence. Not confusion. Silence. Persimmon did not say, "What do you mean?" She did not say, "Who?" She just stopped breathing on the other end of the line. My mother read the opening line of the June letter. Then she read the part about Maeve suspecting. Then she read the line about father trusting Roland. Persimmon whispered, "Where did you get those?" My mother closed her eyes. "That is your first question." Persimmon began to cry. I had heard her cry performatively before, soft and controlled. This was different. It was panicked. "Liora, please. Say it," my mother said. "Say what you did. It was not supposed to go that far. Say it." Persimmon sobbed once. "I was the one seeing Roland." My mother gripped the table edge. "And you let father think it was me." Mother was starting to notice. I was terrified. Roland said if everything came out, his wife would leave him and Daddy would never forgive me. Then Daddy saw you talking to Roland after church and he already seemed suspicious, and I did not correct him. My mother said, "You did more than fail to correct him." Another silence. Then Persimmon said, "Yes." The word was tiny. I reinforced it. "I told him you had been secretive. I told him I was worried about you. I told him maybe you would confess if he stayed firm." My mother's face crumpled, but her voice did not. "You watched him throw me away." Persimmon said, "I regretted it every day." "No, you did not," my mother said. "You benefited from it every day." That was the sentence that broke through all Persimmon's crying. She went quiet again. My mother continued, "You knew about the trust provision." Persimmon did not answer. "You knew," my mother repeated. Persimmon finally said, "Daddy had talked about it. I knew misconduct could affect things, but I was not thinking clearly." I leaned toward the phone. "You were thinking clearly enough to keep saying it for weeks." Persimmon inhaled sharply. "Clara is there?" "Yes," my mother said, "and an attorney has the authenticated letters." That changed everything. Persimmon's voice became sharper, smaller. "An attorney?" "Liora, we do not need to make this public. We can settle this privately. I can explain." My mother said, "You explained enough." Then she hung up. After the call, my mother sat very still. I expected another wave of tears, but instead she looked almost calm, like someone hearing a machine finally stop after years of noise. "I used to wonder what I could have said differently," she told me. "I used to replay every conversation with father. I thought maybe I sounded defensive. Maybe I looked guilty because I was scared. Maybe if I had gone to him one more time. But there was never a right sentence, was there?" She had already chosen the ending. I reached for her hand. "No. There was never a right sentence." Wilhelmina filed a claim on my mother's behalf against the estate soon afterward. The legal language was colder than the truth, but in some ways that made it powerful. Fraud, misrepresentation, undue benefit, testamentary intent procured by false accusation. The claim argued that my grandfather's decision to disinherit my mother had been based on information Persimmon knowingly fabricated and perpetuated, and that Persimmon had financially benefited from the fraud for decades. The filing included Dr. Moss's report, copies of Roland's letters, my mother's old draft to Maribel, the 1987 trust language, the 1991 amendment, and evidence of Persimmon's involvement in the conversations that led to the accusation. Persimmon hired her own lawyer. At first, her response was exactly what Wilhelmina predicted. She did not fully deny the affair because the letters made that impossible. Instead, she claimed my grandfather had made his own decisions for his own reasons. She said she had been young and frightened. She said family memories were complicated. She said my mother had been estranged for reasons beyond that one accusation. Wilhelmina read the response at her conference table and said, "This is what people say when they cannot deny the center of the room, so they rearrange the furniture around it." My mother, who had barely smiled in weeks, actually laughed once. Depositions were scheduled. Persimmon tried to avoid appearing, citing stress and health concerns, but the court ordered her to participate. I was not in the room for her deposition, but Wilhelmina later summarized it. Under questioning, Persimmon admitted she had been involved with Roland Vale. She admitted she knew my grandfather believed my mother was involved with him. She admitted she had not corrected him. Then, after being shown the letters where Roland referenced her strategy directly, she admitted she had made statements that encouraged my grandfather's belief. The most damning moment came when Wilhelmina asked whether Persimmon understood at the time that a finding of moral misconduct could alter inheritance under the family trust. Persimmon said, "I knew Daddy cared about those things." Wilhelmina pressed. Persimmon eventually admitted she had read the trust summary in her father's study before the accusations became final. My mother received that news quietly. She was sitting in Wilhelmina's office with a paper cup of water. "So she knew before," she said. Wilhelmina nodded. "Yes." My mother looked down at her hands. "I do not know why that still hurts more. I already knew," I said, "because it means she had time to stop." My mother nodded. Yes, she had time. Probate court was not dramatic the way movies make courtrooms dramatic. There were no shouting confessions, no judge pounding a gavel while everyone gasped. It was slower, drier, more methodical. But there was a different kind of satisfaction in watching the lie get dismantled piece by piece in a place where Persimmon could not control the family tone with tears. Documents mattered. Dates mattered. Postmarks mattered. My mother's old letter mattered. The nickname Percy mattered. The fact that Roland had described my mother as confused and broken mattered. The trust provision mattered. Persimmon sat across the room in a charcoal suit, looking older than I had ever seen her. She did not look at my mother. My mother wore a dark green dress and my grandmother's small silver locket, one of the few things she had been allowed to keep from childhood. When Wilhelmina presented the timeline, my mother kept her eyes forward. I kept thinking about her at 26, standing in that same family system with no lawyer, no documents, no one willing to listen. Now she had all of it. The judge's decision came weeks later. The court found that my mother's exclusion from the estate had been materially influenced by fraudulent misrepresentation knowingly perpetuated by Persimmon, and that allowing Persimmon to retain the full benefit would unjustly reward the fraud. The remedy did not rewrite every wound, but it restored my mother's equal share of the estate. The orchard land and investment accounts were divided according to what the earlier equal distribution would have required, adjusted for certain expenses and probate rules. Some personal property had to be sold. Persimmon fought hardest over the house, but in the end she could not keep it outright. My mother did not want to live there. She said the walls had heard too much silence. The house was sold, and my mother's share gave her financial security she had never expected. More importantly, the legal record now said what the family had refused to say for 30 years. Clara Fenwick had not betrayed her family. She had been betrayed by it. After the ruling, Persimmon wrote my mother a letter. Not a text, not an email, A handwritten letter, perhaps because she thought paper could make regret look dignified. My mother let me read it. Persimmon said she was sorry. She said fear had made her selfish. She said Roland had manipulated her. She said she had loved my mother despite everything. My mother read it once, folded it, and placed it in a drawer. She did not respond. A few weeks later, Persimmon called me. I almost did not answer, but curiosity won. Her voice sounded thin. "Clara, I know you hate me." I said, "This is not about hate. I lost my sister. You gave her up 30 years ago." She cried then, but I felt nothing move in me. Maybe that sounds harsh. But I had watched my mother spend a lifetime grieving a father who had been turned against her. Persimmon's grief was new. My mother's had been old enough to have roots. Persimmon said, "I was young." I said, "So was she." She said, "I was scared." I said, "So was she." She said, "I cannot change it." I said, "No, you cannot." Then I ended the call. My mother changed after the case, but not in the simple way people imagine. She did not become instantly light. She did not forgive everyone and move on. Some days she seemed relieved, almost peaceful. Other days she was angrier than I had ever seen her. She told me that truth did not erase grief. It gave grief a name, and that helped, but it also made certain memories sharper. She remembered birthdays when she waited for a call from her father that never came. She remembered my birth, when she mailed him a photograph of me and never received a reply. She remembered my grandmother's funeral, where Persimmon stood beside Grandfather Emerick in the front pew, while my mother sat 3 rows back like a distant cousin. All those moments rearranged themselves around the new fact. Persimmon had known. Persimmon had always known. One afternoon, months after the ruling, my mother and I drove past the old orchard property. The house had sold to a family from Boston who planned to restore it. The apple trees were bare for winter, their branches black against the pale sky. My mother asked me to pull over by the stone wall. We sat in the car without speaking for a while. Finally, she said, "I thought finding out the truth would make me miss him less." "Does it?" I asked. She shook her head. "No. It makes me miss the father he might have been if he had asked one more question. That, to me, is the saddest part. My grandfather was not innocent. He chose pride over his daughter. He chose reputation over investigation. He chose Persimmon's performance over my mother's denial. But he was also lied to, and the lie fit so neatly into his worst instincts that he never tried to pull it apart. Persimmon did not create his rigidity. She used it. She knew exactly where to place the falsehood so it would grow. Wilhelmina told us once, after the case closed, that old family fraud often survives because people confuse silence with proof. The accused person gets tired. The witnesses die. The documents disappear. The beneficiary becomes the keeper of the story. By the time anyone asks questions, the lie has inherited the authority of age. In our case, the only reason the truth survived was because Roland Vale, foolish and sentimental and careless, kept writing letters, and Persimmon, arrogant or nostalgic or simply reckless, never destroyed them. That box sat in an attic for more than 30 years while my mother raised me, worked 2 jobs at times, cared for neighbors, sent holiday cards that were never answered, and carried a shame that did not belong to her. Sometimes I think about the version of my life where I did not climb those attic stairs. Maybe Persimmon would have cleaned the attic alone and burned the letters. Maybe the estate would have closed quietly. Maybe my mother would have died someday, still wondering why her father found it so easy to believe the worst of her. That thought makes me feel cold. Evidence can be fragile. Truth can be unbelievably dependent on who opens which box on which afternoon. My mother keeps 1 copy of the most important letter in a folder with the court order. Not because she wants to reread it, but because she says she spent too long without proof. She does not speak to Persimmon now. There are relatives who think that is sad. A few even suggested that since the money was settled and Persimmon had admitted what she did, the sisters should try to heal. My mother answered one cousin with more grace than I could have managed. She said, "Healing does not require me to invite the person who wounded me back into the room." That ended the conversation. As for me, I still think about Persimmon at that lunch, smiling over tea while the name Percy sat in the air like a key she did not know I had found. I think about my mother at 26, writing to Maribel, asking why no one would ask her anything except whether she was ready to confess. I think about my grandfather's will, turning a lie into an inheritance plan. And I think about the attic box, ordinary and dusty and patient, holding the one thing a liar fears most, a record. If you were in my place, would you have confronted Persimmon immediately in that attic? Or would you have waited until the evidence was strong enough that she could not escape it? And if you were my mother, Could you ever speak to a sister who stole your father, your reputation, and 30 years of your rightful life? Share what you would have done, because stories like this are never just about money or old letters. They are about who gets believed, who gets erased, and what it takes to bring the truth back into a family that buried it. Thank you for listening, and subscribe for more true-feeling family stories about betrayal, inheritance, secrets, and the women who finally get their names cleared. Take care, and I will see you in the next story.